Ladies and gentlemen, gamers, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'll be covering the British Forces Deep Dive that was recently released by Relic. I'm very excited for this personally because I didn't get to play too much of the British Forces during the tech test, and I would love to learn more about them. They're pretty unique and different from previous British factions in the Company of Heroes franchise, so it's very cool to see, especially that they're in North Africa now. One funny note personally is that I was just on a train ride on the way home to my hometown yesterday, about an hour and a half train ride, and I was listening to a podcast on Winston Churchill. Really interesting. I'll actually leave a link to that podcast in the description below. But what perfect timing to come home and have this deep dive available. It looks really cool. So we'll be covering it in real time, and I'll be giving my impressions, but I'm excited to hear what the devs have to say, and let's jump
For
in.
joining us. So Matt, before we jump in and look at some of these games, we always kind of like to start these things with a big picture overview, and then we can get into some of the finer details about the British forces. So I'm curious, Matt, how did we, or how did the team approach the design of the British this time around? Because they've obviously been a mainstay in the series for quite some time.
Well, I mean, man, it feels like so long ago when we first started these factions and specifically the British. But so, at the starting point of all this, we knew we were going to go with four factions out of the gates, and that this is also within the Mediterranean theater, and we wanted to make sure that with the British Army that we do them justice in both Italy and in North Africa. But they were very different armies in terms of how they were composed. For example, a lot of the equipment available to them in Italy was actually American at the time. But yeah, so our
I mean, that's awesome to hear. I mean, just right away, Matt, the lead gameplay designer, it's so great to hear the lead gameplay designer talk about the historical elements of the British faction in 1940, 1941 in North Africa, because he's designing the game not just from a purely gameplay standpoint, but also the historical lens, like a historical perspective. So I love the attention to detail historically with Co 3. That's really exciting to hear because we're going to get a fresh introduction to the British as they were in North Africa. So that's awesome.
our starting point was just looking at the theater itself and what units were available and tools and toys and things like that for the British Army. And then I think ultimately when we looked at the research there as well as what we did on the previous games, we kind of wanted to start fresh with this army, and really see if we could still root it and ground it in some of its defensive capabilities and qualities and certain aspects that are thematic throughout all the series with the British forces. But we did want to implement and incorporate some nuance and a few other different things. For example, with the North Africa armies, specifically being the Africa Corps and the British forces, we wanted them to be more vehicle centric and more mechanized
Right.
focused all around.
Oh, interesting.
We wanted, instead of that defensive warfare, or what some players called Slim City of some of the previous British factions, we wanted a lot of vehicles. It's kind of what we wanted in a way. So
Yeah, I did notice that. Just watching some games, I watched Helping Hans quite a bit, and other content creators playing the British, and I played them myself. There's a lot of light vehicles. Of course, for the DAC, there's a ton of light vehicles. They're a mechanized core through and through. But I was surprised to see how many light vehicles the British had as well, which is very cool, and also kind of adds to that aggressive element to them, or at least more mobile element.
I'll pause there, but because I know there's going to be a lot more stuff to
Yeah,
tackle and to talk about. But I don't know, that's a starting point, and
yeah,
we can get into
no,
more of it
that's
as we go.
a good place to start. So I'm curious. Will, maybe you can speak to this. What were some of our maybe big goals with this faction in Company of Heroes 3, and how may of that have differed from their past iterations? I know we can address this up front. In Co 2, the British were very emplacement focused. I know the term SimCity was thrown around a lot.
Yeah, no
Was
one
there an
likes
intentional
SimCity.
choice to change how they play?
Yeah, absolutely. We obviously received feedback from players from Co 1 and Co 2 about the state of the Brits. They were very much an enjoyed faction by, say, the casual audience, the SimCity, the emplacements, the entrenchment in particular. But it never really made them viable in a competitive roster. So we wanted to try and meet at least halfway.
Exactly.
And
That's great
because
to
the
hear.
Brits this time around are being portrayed earlier in the war, it's 1941 in terms of the Brits in North Africa. This is still fresh off their defeats in France. This is still very much a youthful army.
Yeah, look at this. Even Will, both of these guys are taking the historical context into the gameplay design. That's just amazing to see. I love that, and that's typical of the franchise. I mean, the game has done its best over the years, but it's so cool to see that in Co 3 right now because you're getting a real fresh introduction to these factions that we are used to. We've seen before, right? But they're in a completely new way now. I love that.
Because it's the North African desert as well, they are far more mobile.
Yeah.
So that was a perfect opportunity really to bring in new vehicles that we hadn't seen before and add that kind of mixed mobility with plenty of tools to at least start bogging down the enemy without going too far into the deep entrenchments, almost the World War One style entrenchments and defenses.
Right. And I guess that kind of speaks to, Matt, something you were talking about earlier about this heavier focus on light vehicles sort of throughout the early and mid game. So again, it feels like a very conscious choice to push Co 3 in that direction.
For sure.
I'm going to load up our first game here. This is going to be a 1v1 that we're going to be looking at. But while I load that up, Matt, maybe you can speak to where we feel the British kind of fit into Co 3's multiplayer when compared to some of the other factions. And I know you've talked about faction pillars a lot in the past. So maybe you could speak to kind of where they fit and what some of those faction pillars are for the British, and I'll get our game ready.
It's a really good question.
Sounds good.
Curious about that.
Yeah, let's see where to start. I think one of the things with the British faction or British forces is we wanted them to be a complement to the Afrika Korps faction. And we knew with the Afrika Korps faction that we were going to go with a much more radical and highly complex faction. So to complement that and to off-center it, we wanted to go for a much more, almost like an entry point British faction, a little simpler tech tree, a little more straightforward. We wanted to make sure that players could grasp that tech tree and they didn't have as many weak points throughout the different flows. We also wanted to make sure that they were a very well-rounded army, and you kind of see that in the Sizzles trailer in terms of what it mentions, but well-rounded, sturdy and resilient, and flexible. And I think that's flexible. Like we've talked about diversity a lot in quite a few of the other deep dives that we've done, and we know that's a big pillar for all our faction design. But flexibility is another component that I think we've kind of pushed to the limits also with all our factions this time around. And what that means when I say flexibility is that we're looking to see a greater range or a greater band between allowing factions to be both offensive and defensive and to play. So if, let's say, I like playing defensively, but then, oh man, I can only play the defensive faction. We want to allow players to be able to play defensively, even with maybe the offensively oriented faction.
This is such an important point. I love this, hearing this from Matt. These guys are locked in. I mean, these guys know what they're doing, and you could see it in the faction design. In fact, I've mentioned this before. The faction design of Co 3 is probably my favorite aspect of the game right now. I think it's incredibly well designed, and this is just the beginning. I mean, the battle groups are going to only enhance the factions. But what he just said is so important because in previous games and in many RTS games, you're locked into a specific style of play. Because this is the British deep dive, let's use the British as an example, and this is an obvious point. But the British have always been a very defensive faction, and the Sim-City and emplacements only contributed to that style of play. The faction was inherently weaker offensively, right? So, but in war, right, and historically, if you follow military history in World War II, army divisions and army groups were constantly on the offensive and defensive. I mean, just look at Meinstein, for example, on the Eastern Front, or the British in North Africa. They're launching these large waves of offensive blows, attacks, but then also having to dig in defensively for long periods of time and adapt and change. And so I love to see the flexibility in Co 3. There is so much flexibility in this game. If you look at the tech trees, there's, like we said, multiple tech tiers. Whatever tech path you go, have the available units, the variety of units you need to deal with multiple encounters, right? So it could be, your tech could have artillery, it could have anti-tank, it could have anti-infantry, everything you need, but in a different way, right? So I just love that variety, and I love to see that from these designers. These guys are the ones responsible for making the factions, what they are, and it's just great to see.
Right.
Or vice versa. So in the case of the British, we want them, they may be rooted in being a little bit more defensive compared to the Allied counterpart in the US forces, but we did make specific intentional design changes to allow the British to kind of pierce into enemy lines, maybe a little bit better than the past, specifically with their armor, but also with their infantry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a great way to outline that. I really appreciate that flexibility that players now have with all the factions. So folks, we're going to be hopping into a 1v1. We're going to be watching two of our designers face off against each other. A couple of folks that may be familiar. We have Jason, who's joined us on some of the past live streams. Folks may know him as Tarnation. And we're also going to be having Darren, who also goes by Mirage Flaw, a couple of community hires duking it out in this 1v1. So we're going to be watching from Jason's perspective as the British. And he's going to be playing Darren, who's playing the Wehrmacht. So before we hop into this, just a couple quick notes. Please keep in mind that this build that we're looking at of the game is only a few weeks newer than the one that we used for the tech test. So that means it's still a little bit older than the version of the game that the team is working on right now. And there are still some of those changes and tweaks that we kind of promised and bug fixes that we were working on that we announced after the tech test. Some of those may be reflected here, but not all of them. So just keep that in mind before we jump into this game. So how does the player kind of approach that early game for the British, especially in like a 1v1 setting?
Mm-hmm. Well, the British are, as stated, they are probably still the most defensive of the four factions. Specifically in the early game, we have retained the fact that they have the slowest start, similar to previous British factions. Now, they still they're almost on par in terms of initiative with the Wehrmacht, but they do have to be careful and on their guard when they face off the deck, that's for sure. For example, in their HQ, you have both sappers and the HMG, which kind of complement and encourage that kind of take and hold. You're not going to be able to capture as much territory out of the gate with the British Army, so it just takes them a little bit longer to get into gear, but definitely in mid-game is their strong point. So, yeah.
Dude, I love first of all, to his point, I love the fact that the British are the one faction with the MG team to begin with at the start. I think that adds to the defensive style, but also is very cool positionally, because you could just pick and choose where you want to defend on the map, and it's kind of like you could even be passive aggressive with that posture with the MG team, right? So I like that like early game aspect to the British. They have a lot of their infantry corps available very early on between tier 0 and tier 1. But I don't know if you guys noticed the MG team, the animation behind the unit, as they're running, you have one guy carrying the weapon, you have another guy carrying both ammo boxes in his hand, and the soldiers are not all running in unison. They're not running the same way. One guy is kind of ducked down, and he's maneuvering, and he's holding these two ammo boxes, and the other soldier is setting up the gun. It just looks so good. And then he sits down right on his bottom right there as he's holding the MG weapon. And I just think there's a lot of attention to detail with the unit animations themselves. It's very cool.
You just need to be cautious in the early game. However, we do have, again, talking about that flexibility that I mentioned earlier, there are still components and options available to the player. For example, the Dingo will allow for early scouting and reconnaissance and harassment. And there's also some battle groups that feature Gurkhas and commandos and others that can put on some bit of infantry pressure fairly early on as well.
Mm-hmm. So kind of describing it as a more approachable faction may kind of be a little bit like, I don't want to say off-putting, but it may be, be like, oh, well, does that mean that they're like simple? How do we kind of add complexity and some interesting decisions for the British?
Well, they are, yeah, they are a little bit more linear and simpler out of the gate in the sense that they don't have as many units that they can field in the early game as with the other factions. But this is both, this is something that is kind of intentionally done so that it allows the players to focus more about how they're making use of their units and not which units that do they deploy.
Right.
Interesting.
So if you look at this game in particular, so far, Jason has fielded a rather well-rounded army. He's gone for 1 Sapper, 1 Tommy, 1 HMG, and 1 Dingo. I assume he'll probably get into a few more mainline infantry to bolster his front line. But so far, a well-rounded start, which gives Jason kind of all the necessary tools. He's got a little bit of reconnaissance and harassment. He's got the HMG if needed to hold down, and he's getting some mainline infantry. So, yeah. That's what we got going on so far.
So, Will, maybe you can kind of speak to the map a little bit.
So, okay, real quick, before he jumps into the map, I just kind of want to reinforce what Matt just said. And he's saying that the British faction is more linear by design. And I think that's interesting because it's the one faction that I noticed the tech tree just follows a linear, path straight down. And of course, there's a lot of variety within those tech trees, but it's a pretty straightforward tech path, right? And like we said earlier, you have most of your units available to you right away. Tier 0 and Tier 1, all your infantry corps is available, plus battle groups. So it's really interesting to see that the emphasis is, okay, they're going to say, okay, here's your units. These are the units you're going to have in the early game. Now pick and choose which units you want to prioritize. You have access to basically all of them, right, early on. And then emphasize your positioning because you're limited in your ability to be aggressive. You're limited in your ability to be mobile. You're limited in your ability to dominate the early game. So you got to pick and choose. Very strategic, very positional. So that's very cool to see, in my opinion, because it's much more unique and it plays into a different style than the other factions.
Is there was there anything specific that or to your approach when you're designing sort of some of these smaller 1v1 focused maps? Like how did you approach these maybe a little bit differently than some of the other maps that you're working on? We can use this one as an example as well.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, across the board, when we looked at all of our launch maps, we wanted to make sure that we had a mix of competitive and casual maps. So we have maps that have a lot more cover with choke points for the newer beginner players, something that you can sink your teeth into without getting stomped by the AI. But this map, Road to Tunis, is an example of a more competitive map. It uses a layout that players from Co 1 and Co 2.
Oh, I love that. Look at the troops on top of the building. That is so sick. I didn't get a chance to see that like in game as I was playing. I wasn't really paying attention to those details.
You'll be familiar with.
It looks so good.
It uses a spiral layout. So if you were to go, say, counterclockwise around the map, you have better access to higher resources. But the more resources that you go for, the closer to your enemy's HQ you get. And instead of going for, say, the central line of the map, just pushing all the way up, there's not much resources in doing that. You want to focus heavily on one side or the other.
Interesting.
And it also has very, very strong cutoffs, which is certainly not something that you'd expect to see in a casual map.
Right.
Yeah. And so like the central road that runs right the way through this map, those are both cutoffs. And they will do some serious damage. You only have to hold them for a few seconds, even just decapping. So your opponent isn't getting the resources on their side of the map can really damage you if it's done for long enough.
Right. So can you explain that concept maybe for some of the newer players? So basically, if I capture that cutoff, then the territory points that I control that are no longer attached to the rest of my territory aren't providing me resources. Is that kind of the
exactly.
idea?
So if you look at the minimap at the moment, Jason's holding his side of the map, which is, if you go in counterclockwise, is where...
Okay, so I'm going to just note a couple things here. Right away, one thing I noticed, it's at 3 minutes in the game, the opposing Volksgrenadier team or Grenadier team has SMGs, MP40s equipped. Now that's pretty quick relative to Co 2 at least. It's interesting. Also, between 4 and 5 minutes in the game, there's already artillery going off, if you just noticed there, wiping out that MG team. Very interesting. So the game seems a little accelerated too. The pace of the game is quicker, and as they were just stating, if you look at the map, you'll notice more munitions points, more fuel points. But they made an interesting point that you're incentivized in the game to take a specific path of capturing points because you're going to yield more resources based on the distribution of resources per point. It's a little bit different than Code 2. And then that leads into larger cutoffs on the map. As you can see, these 2 manpower points are major cutoffs. So it's a very interesting kind of tug of war, push and pull, with more emphasis strategically on the map than in previous games.
All of his munitions and fuel points are, well, at least for the most part. If that road is disconnected, all those points on the other side of the road will be flashing because they're not pulling in any resources. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jason would drop down to only having 10 munitions and 10 fuel income. The average for our economy is expected to be about 40 munitions and 20 fuel per minute. Mm-hmm. So he'd be at a significant advantage, way lower, well, lower than half in most cases.
Wow,
than what he
interesting.
Should be doing. So it can be pretty disastrous if you let that road be cut off for too long.
Mm-hmm.
Which I love, because you should be rewarded for a cutoff. In Code 2, when you made a cutoff, it didn't feel that important. Like, it wasn't that devastating to your opponent. But it is a relatively hard thing to do, to cut off your opponent in that manner behind enemy lines, and I think you should be rewarded for that. So it's cool to hear that that's all. You know, you're going to be losing a lot. 40 munitions, 20 fuel per minute. That's awesome.
So Matt, if I'm a newer player going hands-on with this faction, maybe for the first time, what would you want me to know as I hop into the game?
The guys on top, so cool.
That's a tricky one. I think one of the things that, before I answer that, I'm actually going to call out the fact I'm just watching the game right now, and I saw some questions in the chat about this. So someone was asking.
Okay, look at that too, guys. I don't know if you just noticed that in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. That unit got out of cover for just a second, and the MG team wiped out a unit already, right? The time to kill in this game is quicker, and there's a lethality to the interactions. If you're in red cover, or if you get shot, if your unit is opened up on and there's fire coming in, bullets coming in, you're not just going to lose health. You're oftentimes going to lose a soldier. And I like that aspect of lethality to the game, where you're not just taking health damage and you can run across the middle of a road under heavy fire and survive. It doesn't make much sense in Code 2 at least.
About if the British have base artillery available to them, and they do. So that is one component that we liked from Code 2 that we wanted to port over for this game, is that the British are artillery supported. That was also another one of the British, the pillars for the British Army, is that we wanted to feature artillery prolifically throughout the army. And another mention I just wanted to call out, because I've noticed that Jason's got 3 Tommy squads on the field, is that we referenced Code 1 when it came to the flexibility of the Tommy squads and the different upgrades that they could field. So in Company Heroes 1, you could go for a recon package,
look at that,
rifle grenades, and a Bren gun, I believe. And we wanted to...
Look at that, 3 units running across the road and red cover, immediately wiped out within seconds. I think that's great to see. There's more attention to the time to kill on these units, and it's more logical now. There's an actual system behind it that is more consistent. So I really am happy to see that.
To retain that and make the Tommies more flexible and well-rounded compared to their Code 2 counterparts. So you can see in this particular game, Jason's made use of the recon upgrade, which added a scoped rifle, and he's used that to work together with the base artillery to, I think he's done 1 or 2 artillery strikes to kind of push Darren around a few times. It also can provide that package also provides some flares.
That's cool.
But to answer your original question in terms of what you would want to know as a new player going into this faction, trying to think of how to call out specific items with this. Again, I think it's more about what I mentioned earlier in terms of just being aware that they do have a bit more of a slower start, and that is something to be mindful of.
Armored car, that's so cool.
1v1s. It's not so much of a factor in the team games.
Total desert theme.
As a new player, like for example, if you are playing, if we're playing the Italian campaign, which allows you to both play as both the American Army and the British forces, you can't tackle missions as offensively and be as aggressive out of the gate with the British as you can be with the Americans. You kind of can't go charging in. You have to kind of cautiously creep up, get your footing. Then once you get into your vehicles, then start pushing forward a little bit more.
Yeah. And now we're seeing the Humber come out from Jason. And I remember, Will, I think you once told me that this is one of your favorite vehicles. Is that still the case?
It is, yeah. The Humber is just an absolute devil when it gets onto the field. It gets outclassed by vehicles like, say, the 8-Rad, which come a little bit later. But for the window when the Humber is the only vehicle of its class on the field, it just absolutely rips through everything. It's
That's
so
awesome.
Deadly.
So a very small window of opportunity, relatively small window of opportunity with this unit, but I like how the British can get this out, and it, like he said, it is the dominant unit for its time during that window, during that early mid-game transition. You could take advantage and push a certain part of the map with this unit, so that's cool. It's also it looks relatively mobile and packs a punch, very reminiscent of like a scout car, but just looks like a little more armored than a Vermont scout car in KO2.
I was gonna say, because I saw a couple people in the chat call this out, but pay no attention to the resources and the command points. I think some of them might have had the developer mode turned on, but we know Jason and Darren. They're honorable players, so they're not gonna abuse the resources that they have at their disposal. So we did mention some of the major changes that the British are seeing this time around. And most that are watching this right now probably likely went hands-on with them a couple of weeks ago. But can we talk about some of the decisions that went into their roster or maybe their production buildings, and how do we approach this design, Matt? So like, compared to like KO1, KO2 Brits, when it came to like building out that base roster, figuring out what units go in which production building, how did we approach that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier with the tech tree, we did want to hone in on. We honed in pretty early on with a simplified tech tree because we didn't want players to get too hung up on the tech tree itself. And then there is just a plethora of vehicles in this army. A lot of light vehicles and also a lot of heavier tanks as well. There's one of the things that the tech tree features is what we call exclusive choices.
Now look at that right there, the platoon command post. You have an AT gun, you have the Hummel armor car, you have a truck, which can obviously, guys, as you know, if you put the tech test, has medic capabilities and other capabilities. And then that looks like a Stuart or a light tank. And then we have another vehicle darkened in gray. I can't exactly see it, but if you look at the upgrade here, the T upgrade, you can unlock it. So tons of vehicles available in this mid-game.
So you can see in that tier 2 building right now that you can specifically call out the bishop or the Stuart tank to kind
it's
of
a bishop and
Stuart
Stuart.
forces.
Okay,
But
that's what I thought.
There's a lot of all-purpose, well-rounded vehicles within this army that are all really good and suited, that work well and synergize well with infantry.
So look, he just said they work well and synergize well with infantry. So tier 0 and tier 1 for the British, linear, you have a lot of access to your infantry. Basically all the infantry you're going to need. Then in tier 2, you have access to not only your AT gun, but a lot of options with vehicles, predominantly light vehicles, but tons of options there. So you already have this growing army and these growing options. You don't have to choose all of them. You don't, like he said, you don't have to work too hard to decide between tech paths, but you do have to prioritize your unit composition. So I like that. That plays into the idea of flexibility that we saw in the British Sizzle trailer. The army is very flexible and it looks like very mobile relative to other British factions.
We obviously see the Humber on the field right now, but there's also the Stuart, there's the Bishop, there's the Crusader, Grant, and Matilda, and they all have different play styles to them. And that's really fascinating to see how they all pair up with the infantry and into these new ways of playing these new tactics.
So follow-up question. How do some of the teching options for the British look this time around? How am I upgrading and progressing through my buildings and unlocking those upgrades to ensure that I'm staying ahead of my opponents? I know you already called out some of the exclusive choices, but what else what other sort of decisions and teching options am I kind of going through?
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of upgrades on the Tommies as stated. And then in the mid game for your tier 2 building, there's the exclusive choices, which allow you pretty much, they're designed with the intent that they have a very strong mid game, but you don't need to make use of that. But you can stay into that longer if you choose to do so. And then you can get into the final tier, where again there's just a lot of available options to you, and then you can spec harder through those exclusive choices. So pretty much what we have is a fairly linear tech tree that has additional options throughout what the player can then field in terms of units. There aren't as many global upgrades or unit upgrades to this army, again because we wanted to keep them a little bit more simpler, a little bit more refined, and a bit of a tighter experience for players.
Oh, interesting.
So the other thing I'm kind of curious about is the new ways to play that are on offer for fans of the British, because we do have some interesting battle group decisions and choices. This time around, Jason went with the Indian artillery.
Dude, the flamethrowers look so good.
I think this was kind of a fan favorite during the technical test. But yeah, Will, maybe you want to jump on this question, but like, what are some of the interesting new ways to play the British that are on offer this time around?
Yeah, well, we might as well start with the Indian artillery, since it's what Jason's gone for anyway. So we've already talked before about the battle groups, how they kind of a new spin on the doctrines and the commander system from the previous games. With the Indian artillery, you have either a path towards making your infantry more resilient or cheaper, bringing out units like the Gurkha, and then progressing down towards the war cry ability and pillaging. To give you an example of what Jason's got at the moment, he's gone for cheaper reinforcements, so his infantry losses will not impact him as much. He's gone for the Gurkha infantry, which are kind of a mid-game strong anti-infantry squad. He's equipped the Gurkhas that he's got with Bren guns, so they're better for the long mid-range engagements, but you can give them Thompsons for the close ones. And he's also gone for pillage, which means that any infantry losses he inflicts will reward him with munitions, and any vehicle losses he inflicts will grant him fuel. So now Darren has to be careful as to what units he throws away.
Right.
For example, this Whirlwind, if he lets that get caught out in the field by infantry, he's going to end up paying for it.
Yeah, I actually really love that ability, because it kind of incentivizes you to play a little bit more aggressively, which is just always fun.
Yeah, and that's the intention. That's one of the ways that the British can be the more aggressive faction. Now Jason has that incentive to push harder, and Darren has to be a little bit more careful. But
Very
the
interesting.
same can go for the other battle groups that we have, like the British Armoured, which has access to the Churchills, the Black Prince, improved repairs and sappers. But we also have the Air and Sea, which is a mix between the Royal Marines and the Commandos. So the Commandos will have your typical power drops with your pack howitzers as well, whereas the other side will have access to the 95mm Centaur, which will is so much fun. That thing punches through buildings and cover like it's nothing.
Yeah, I think we'll see more of that battle group in the next game.
Perfect.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about the veterancy system and how that works for the British compared to maybe like the USF or the Wehrmacht that we've already covered off. So
The game looks so good. I'm just observing the visuals, the destructive environments, the blood animation on the ground, and if you notice, some of these guys are wounded and they're not dead. I noticed that in Co 3 there's more attention to wounded soldiers because there's a larger focus on medics going out into the battlefield, grabbing these wounded soldiers and creating what's called zombie squads. Basically, if you can get, let's say, 6 units back to base, 6 wounded soldiers back to base via your medics, you can be you can be awarded with a new squad, essentially. So I love that aspect of the game where there's even wounded soldiers play into the element of comeback mechanics and recovering, and it's kind of like a macro component to the game.
So Matt, the upgrade building for the British seemingly allows us to expedite how certain units earn veterancy. Can you explain how that works and the design decision behind it?
Yeah. So all factions feature standard status quo veterancy system with passive capabilities, and they also provide active abilities as well at Vet 1, with the exception that the American forces also have a selection point for your Vet 1 ability. But yeah, one unique component to the British Army is they have what we call a training center, and that training center allows you to bolster your veterancy rate through different archetypes. So if you plan, this is very useful for team games. So if you plan to play, for example, with a large infantry army or a large mechanized army, or maybe potentially an army that's playing a hole with a lot of team weapons, you can dial into those specific upgrades and allow them to boost your veterancy rate, and that will definitely have a significant impact on the battle.
Wow, that is super cool.
So
I didn't know
saw
that.
some people talking some smack about our friend the Dingo in the chat. I saw some unkind comments about the Dingo. However, I think the Dingo is underrated, especially once it hits Vet 1. So Matt will.
It's one of my favorite units. Like,
Yeah.
actually, you already used, Jason used it really nicely for example, just reconnaissance, harassment, and at one point early in the game, there is a medical kit ability that allows for free healing, and Jason made use of that, I think, once or twice. So, for example, if you don't want to pay the fuel to get into your traditional healing building, and for example, let's say at this stage in the game, or maybe you're like, you're a little worried that you might lose the Dingo on the battlefield, you can park that thing in your base and it can act as like a forward ambulance.
Wow.
In a way.
That's cool.
Another useful tool about it is that it works in tandem with the forward artillery position. So I think, I'm not too sure if Jason's made use of that too much this game, but Jason at any point in time can drop some flares for either a decoy strike to maybe fake his opponent out, or an actual real artillery strike. So
that's something I notice about Co 3 is there's so much utility to these early game factions that you don't want to just throw the unit away, right? After it served its quote unquote purpose. There's a lot of scalability to the unit, a lot of value that you can accrue over time. With the Dingo they're using, for example, he just said, if you don't want to get the medic station right away, it costs fuel. And it might not cost a lot of fuel, but when you're doing a specific build order, let's say you're rushing out a Stuart light tank as the British, and you really want to capitalize on that window of opportunity, or you're rushing to that armored car we saw, and you want to get that out really, really fast and take advantage of that for a specific reason, you're not going to necessarily go for that medic station, but you could use your Dingo in the early game to give you that early advantage with flares, let's say, and pushing like out a Kettenkrad, or maybe giving you an advantage in certain infantry engagements, and then you could return it back to base, like he said, use it as a medical station until you've gotten out your light tank, and then you can go back and get your medic station, which costs fuel, and the Dingo can hit the battlefield once again, and then be used as, let's say, scouting, flares, or forward medic. So I noticed that the light vehicles, you want to keep them alive, and not just because you want to be a good player, but because they actually have a lot of utility.
So it's got some legs, and you're touching on one of the elements. So with Company Heroes 3, we wanted to reintroduce ultra light vehicles properly back, kind of like Co 1. Co 1 had quite a few of these. Co 2 had a couple as well. But one of the things, and this is always a design challenge for us, is we try our best to make sure that every unit that we make into the game scales to some degree. Now, of course, a Dingo, once the tanks start hitting the field, it can be challenging, right? So you typically will have to, when we say scale, that means we have to think of creative ways to, modify its role into potentially, it could be a support role, it could be a reconnaissance role, it could be a healing role, but something else, because we know it's, hard to get into the fights as the game progresses.
So I can't quite tell what battle group Darren went with as the Wehrmacht.
You went with the Breakthrough.
Breakthrough, right? Gotcha.
Yeah. So Darren had fielded.
The animation looks cool. The fire looks really cool. The post-explosion animation and everything. The explosions looked okay. I didn't love seeing those actual bombs coming down so visibly like that. They were it doesn't look totally polished to me, so I would like to see that kind of a little bit more fluid, a little bit smoother. They just looked a little awkward coming down and onto the ground.
Early on in the he went for Breakthrough, and then you get a 0 CP pick, which allows your Grenadiers to turn into Assault Grenadiers.
Right.
So Darren's been trying to be offensive with his assault grenadiers. He just made use of, I believe that was the, I don't remember the name of the ability, but essentially an incendiary bombing run.
Yeah, the assault grenades are also very good.
I love the lights too.
Yes.
when they connect.
So cool looking.
So we're kind of in the mid-game portion. Will, what do you think? What decisions should Jason be making as the British here? He's got victory points lead, but the I think map control is kind of evenly split at this point. So what do you think Jason needs to do here to kind of secure this victory for himself?
Well, the next step is moving into his medium tanks. He's already seen that a Whirlwind is out in the field, and even though his Stuart can plink away at the Whirlwind, it's not armored enough that it can be completely resilient, so that's a bit of a dangerous move. The next step for me would be just to roll out a Crusader, which is his... I suppose it's more of the equivalent of the medium tank, but it's so fast for the British. The Crusader is a cruiser tank. So not quite as armoured, not quite as upgunned, it's only using a 2-pounder, but cheap enough that you could probably pull 2 of them onto the field. Those Crusaders in pairs are so deadly, especially now that we've included things like side armour. The Crusader never has to really get behind its opponent, it only has to keep pace with them and stay on its side and just blink away, and that's all it needs to do.
Interesting.
He could go for guards in the final tech building, but honestly, with the amount of assault infantry on the field, that's probably not worth the cost.
Right.
Because the guards, even though they have 2 bazookas and can deal with that Whirlwind from range, there's no way that they'll survive against this many assault grenadiers.
Mm-hmm. Plus, he also already has the Gurkhas that kind of fit that similar role of assault
Yes.
infantry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, yep, there it is, as you called it. Well, there's the Crusader. I do love the 6-pounder gun conversion. What was the kind of thinking around that upgrade for the Crusader?
Oh, cool.
Just again allowing it to be a little bit more sustainable over time and scale up. So as Will mentioned, these, they are kind of somewhat situated as being somewhat the mainline battle tank for the British forces, but it is a little more light and nimbler, and the 2-pounder gun doesn't make it as effective. So if we wanted to allow players that if they want to really pursue quite a few Crusaders, that they can just have a little bit more scalability.
That's
overall.
amazing. Yeah.
However, if you go to, actually, are you able to take a look at what you have in the final tier of the,
yes,
the building?
Of course.
There? So this is where I think the British are very different to some of the that they're very different to some of the previous armies of the past. One of the things right out of the gate that you'll notice is they have an infantry unit in their final building. And I think, personally, I love this. It's
Foot Guard section. Elite infantry armed with close-range Thompson submachine guns and 2 M9 bazookas, and they can throw grenades. Okay. I never actually built this during the tech test, but 399 manpower, 10 manpower supply. So elite infantry with close-range Thompsons and 2 bazookas. So relatively versatile. 2 bazookas are going to make them relatively weak close range, you would assume, right? Even though they're elite infantry. Close range against infantry, they might not fare very well. I don't know. I have to test it more and see. But it looks like predominantly an anti-tank unit. But, it has anti-infantry capabilities. A lot of tanks available in this last tier, which is awesome. And then obviously the upgrade, as you see TNG there.
Really nice to see that this army finally has to not just rely on just Tommies as a whole, and that they now have a complementary or supplementary infantry through the guards. So, of course, in this instance, Jason has pulled out the Gurkhas. However, the guards are just really nice, well-rounded assault infantry that have both bazookas and short-range weaponry that they allow you to really pierce into enemy lines. And then you got all these different tanks, which, on the surface you might go like, well, they're kind of similar, but in practice, as you play with them, you'll find that they're really different.
Yeah,
the Crusade. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I did see some people call out or sort of kind of question oh, why do you have both the Matilda and the Grant? They seemingly sit fit the same sort of role. But yeah, I interrupted you, so because I know you're about to get into it.
Yeah, no problem. No, even at first when we were prototyping and testing the 3 tanks, we had some internal concerns about having 3 tanks that were kind of somewhat similar in certain aspects. But over time, we've through abilities and stats and different modifications to all the vehicles, they do feel really different. You've got the Crusader, which kind of acts as the harassment mad dash tank, very good at flanking. You've got the Matilda, which is kind of your just classic tanky tank, which will sponge. The Matilda, I love when players field it because it's a game changer. It suddenly changes the whole state of the match. Wow.
Look how quickly, I mean, that building went through several iterations of destruction before it finally collapsed. That was awesome. He got out of the building as it was collapsing. That looks really good, the animation there.
Oh, there's some good assault grenades there going, and that was awesome.
And then the rubble can be used as cover now. I'm assuming that's green cover. That's great.
And then you've got the Grant, which is just a really good, sturdy frontline tank. And there's one. This is a subtle component that's in the British Army. I think, of course, factions take time to explore and discover things. But in the tech test, what we have is we actually have something called a withdraw and refit ability, which actually allows the British Army to exchange their tanks for another tank on the battlefield. And
wow.
We've seen games, and I've seen really good use of this. An example, let's say you've gone for multiple Crusaders and you're trying to flank everywhere, but you can't be successful. You know, maybe your opponent is just all around you with the right counters. You can switch those out for maybe Grants or a Matilda, and you suddenly change the landscape of the ecosystem of the battlefield.
Wow, that is a mechanic that I have not seen too much in RTS games in general. I love that flexibility component once again for the British in the late game. Sort of, switching between not just techs, but actual late game vehicles themselves based on what you're seeing on the front line. You could do that both, passively, reactively, if you're reacting to an opponent's army composition, let's say, or you can kind of do it proactively where you're trying to keep your opponent on the back foot and you could pivot and switch based on your aggressive posture, and trying and outthink your opponent, outmaneuver him in some way, catch him off guard. So, wow, that I didn't know about that mechanic. I played the least of the British faction, so I'm learning these things for the first time, and that is very cool to see.
Throw your opponent off guard, and I've seen it really. I think it's something that takes a little bit of time for players to cue into. But when it's used, it can be in the right situation. It's a pretty interesting tactic to mention. Mm-hmm. And then the last unit that we haven't talked about in the final building is also the Pheasant. And this one, both the DAC and the British forces feature a towed large caliber anti-tank gun, which is awesome to see.
Very cool.
My guess is you probably won't see that in this match. However, that hits hard and is really fun. And unlike previous games that is featured in placement, this allows you to be mobile with that 17-pounder.
Right. So I feel like this match is starting to wind down. Darren's kind of on the back foot here. If you're playing as the Wehrmacht here, what would you try and do with this sort of last big push?
Honestly, Jason's got so much infantry, I would probably have to spec into something like a Brumbar or even side deck into a Nebelwerfer. Mm-hmm. But at this late stage, it is hard to justify something that is anti-infantry only, because there are tanks in the field, and there's more and more tanks coming onto the field now. Yeah. This is a tough spot, and with those Crusaders, even though an anti-tank gun would be an option, you are going to have to get them on the right draw. Like the Crusader is fast enough to outflank an AT gun, in the same way that it's fast enough to outflank a Stug.
There's the M3 Grant. So cool looking.
Is probably the smarter option here, trying to get another one of those, because at least they have a turret that can turn and catch up with the speed. But now the Grant is on the field as well. In a one-to-one fight, that Panzer IV is going to be really struggling.
Yeah, and I feel like that double artillery barrage of the air burst and the normal barrage in the mid there a couple minutes ago was pretty devastating for Darren.
Yeah. Something I noticed with this fight as well that is a little hidden gem in this battle group. Jason unlocked the heavy mortar, which is only available with the Indian artillery. That comes into the map towed. That comes with the 15 CWT truck, which is the British reinforcement platform. So that truck can reinforce troops in the field. It can be upgraded to heal as well. But it seems like Jason's done well enough, and he's kept that dingo alive long enough to have the healing on it, that he just hasn't needed to use that.
Yeah, I think the other...
So once again, multi-purpose. If you call in that heavy motor, it's towed by a truck, which you can purchase and upgrade with medic capabilities. But if you just go this specific battle group and you get this heavy motor out quick, if you incorporate that into your strategy, you also have a lot of purpose for the truck, not just towing it to the front line quickly, but using it as a medical support all over the front line and transportation and so forth. That's great to see.
The other really cool thing about the heavy mortar is, I didn't realize this until recently, is that it has crazy range. Like it's incredible at like reaching those far distances on the map and sort of surprising the enemy.
I like the heavy motor a lot,
especially on a map this size. Yeah, it's very effective.
So I think this match is about to wind down here, so we'll maybe ask a question while we transition to the next match, which is going to be a 3v3. But Matt, maybe final thoughts after seeing that match. What was your big takeaway in this British versus Wehrmacht 1v1?
No, I really like watching these two factions go at it. I find they have, because I think we're still, as developers, in the discovery phase of actually seeing how these two particular factions stack up to each other. In that particular game, I really liked Jason's use of just a fantastic use of combined arms across the board, of course. Very well artillery supported. Now, in that artillery you had the Dingo, you had the recon package, you also had the airburst, and it really kept Darren off balance. Had to keep shifting. And I think another notable for me in that game is you really saw how the British, their mobility shined in the mid to later game, specifically with their vehicles. Yeah. Like you really see that Jason spread Darren out on a wide front. He had the Humber, the Stuart, the Crusader, all these vehicles kind of everywhere. And the Wehrmacht, they do need to probably consolidate their forces and bubble up a little bit more. So it was really interesting to see that defensive versus mobility style of the vehicle matchups within that space and how that played out. But it was a good game on both fronts. It
was a good game. I enjoyed that. That was a better game than the previous deep dives, in my opinion. And like Matt said, I really like the fact that you have this linear tech tree with the British that unpacks these large options, whether it's Tier 0, Tier 1 infantry, Tier 2, Tier 3, all these vehicles between ultra light vehicles, and heavier vehicles. And then all the little abilities that you can unpack with those vehicles that scale into the later game. Like we saw, you can purchase upgrades on your vehicles, your mid-game vehicles, that make them stronger in the late game. So again, your investments, your prioritizations all have major implications. There's just so many more ways to play this game. And to see the British go on the offensive against the Wehrmacht and take the initiative is very cool. I'm very excited. I know they said this is only a couple weeks older than the previous build, but it's already looking better. The map terrain looks better. The unit animations look really good. And it's only going to get better, guys. The polish is only going to improve. The core gameplay is fantastic. And, when the game launches, we're going to have the most modernized build. And I think that's going to be a significant improvement over what we played and what we've seen. So very excited. I'm going to cut this one here. This is going to be a 1v1. And then they just said we're going to be moving into a 2v2. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to cover that in the next video. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. I really enjoyed it. And if you did, go ahead and smash the like button. Leave a comment on your feedback on the British. I'd love to hear it. And if you can, guys, subscribe. It goes a long way in helping me grow this channel as a new content creator and player for Co3. And I'll see you guys in the next one.